Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to those who were with us yesterday. Welcome to those of you who are joining the Corporate Counsel and Compliance Exchange conference today. Same format as yesterday, another round of fantastic speakers coming up over the next few hours. I will add to Anila's comment. I would urge you to please use the Q&A function to send questions through to the speakers, the panelists, the moderators. This is one thing that those virtual conferences are very good at. It's easier to ask questions. We see them come up, and we will, everyone involved will do their utmost to answer them during their respective sessions or afterwards if need be. So without further ado, I'm delighted to say we have Jan Brederhoft, Associate Legal Director at Huawei, who is our keynote speaker and opening the session today. He's going to be talking to us about EU cybersecurity strategy, which was a hot topic yesterday and is going to be something that will haunt all of us, whatever our roles are, over the next few years. It's my great pleasure to hand over to Jan.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kevin. Thanks a lot, Anila. I'm very happy to be here. And yes, I'm delighted to hear that cybersecurity already has been subject to discussion yesterday. And well, speaking from Huawei, from the European headquarters in Düsseldorf, I will hope to shed some light how we see EU cybersecurity policy in the EU. So before we speak about what the EU is doing, what the EU is planning, let's go a few years back. It is Saturday, 13th May 2017, Frankfurt main station. Possibly you have all been there, and passengers running for their trains. And then when they're looking up to checking for their connection, they are up to an unpleasant surprise. There is on display where they would normally see the connections for their train, they read a message which reads, let's say, as such messages normally begin, right? It reads, "Dears, your files have been encrypted." It follows a complicated description on how to release the encrypted data and how to pay for it, obviously in Bitcoin only. And this is all in plain view for everyone to see. And you may say, this is a visible sign that something new may have begun. Because what passengers were witnessing on this day was part of the biggest cybersecurity attack worldwide to this date, the WannaCry attack. WannaCry attack. I think the name speaks for itself. So during this attack, 230,000 computers have been attacked, 150 countries affected, and the estimate is that the damages amounts to more than $4 billion USD worldwide. So WannaCry was standing out from any other previous attack. But why? It was the first time that cybersecurity attack reached the physical world at this scale, affecting in particular also what we now call critical infrastructure. So for instance, transportation companies in Germany, the train company that I just mentioned, but also telecommunication providers in Spain, the National Health Service in the UK, about 220,000 gas stations in China. So any important country in the world, you name it, had been affected. What was also clear, this was not an inside job. These were external hackers attacking the system. And later, it was found out that it's been made possible by a vulnerability in a consumer household name US software that you will all be familiar with, which was known to the US authorities for a long time, but who then did not inform the software provider, some say supposedly to make use of the vulnerabilities for their own purposes. And thus it could be abused by third-party hackers. But what contributed greatly to the scale of the damage, and I think this is the key point here actually, was at the time the lack of even the most basic security measures at its target. And that on some of the most sensitive critical infrastructures you can think of. In other words, the unpreparedness based on what you can say almost a naive level of trust. And the trust, we will come back to the term trust in the context of cybersecurity a little bit later. So, and thus governments around the world, they began to understand that the current security frameworks were not catching up. They were not catching up with a dynamic transformation to an increasingly interconnected world. A transformation, you may say, that is binding the virtual and the physical world increasingly together. And since then, we have seen a not so small number of great scale attacks, most recently, for instance, SolarWind attacks that you certainly have also noticed in the media, but also many others. So if we now fast forward 4 years, the European Commission obviously is in full swing to tackle the issue. Of course, not since today, but for quite some time, but also very intensively since the WannaCry attack. We may have heard about the State of the Union address by Commission President Ursula von der Leyen a few days ago, where she says, quote, "If everything is connected, everything can be hacked. Given that resources are scarce, we have to bundle our forces." In the EU, she means. And one day later, Commissioner Thierry Breton, a somewhat French counterpart of her, provided a bit more detail. And he said, according to the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, ENISA, attacks on EU supply chains will increase fourfold in 2021 compared to last year. Attacks on cloud infrastructure have even increased fivefold in 1 year, and the main targets being transport, government, and industry sectors. So the objective, as articulated by those EU leaders, is clearly defined. The objective is to make the EU a leader for cybersecurity on a global stage. So according to Commissioner Breton, the EU, its member states, and the private sector could invest up to 4.5 billion euro until 2027 in the development of cybersecurity technologies. And as a concrete example of an area where investment will be necessary, Breton points to the fact that today it takes an average of 190 days to detect a sophisticated attack. You may have thought also of something like WannaCry or SolarWind. The aim, he says, is to drastically reduce this time to just about a few hours. So that's where we say, where we stand. Many of the aspects mentioned by von der Leyen and Breton are also reflected in the so-called EU cybersecurity strategy released at the end of 2020, which is covering essential services such as hospitals, energy grids, railways, and the ever-increasing number of connected objects in our homes, offices, and factories. Now, sometimes, at least including also what we refer to as IoT, Internet of Things. But in short, essentially covering the entire kaleidoscope of emerging security challenges and the respective products post WannaCry. So this strategy aims at building collective, which means EU-wide capabilities to respond to major cyber attacks, obviously. To sum it up, the EU is pushing for better cooperation, in particular among the EU member states, but also, of course, with partners across the world, but also greater investment, substantially improved capabilities in cybersecurity, and all to make the EU a cybersecurity leader, technologically and politically, also to be at par with other great powers on a geopolitical playing field, and to establish and maintain. The EU likes to use the language of technological sovereignty. So I think it's not a secret that when the EU speaks of technological sovereignty, a lot of times they think about the US on the one hand and China on the other hand. But how to get there? What is the experience with current strategies, instruments, and legislation in the EU? And also, what are the potential pitfalls and risks EU cybersecurity policy may encounter on the way? It may help to take a look back. Let's recapitulate some of the recent and ongoing legislative and policy initiatives in this domain. So let's have a look at how the cyber strategy folds into the existing framework, the framework of security measures, and the expanding universe of instruments. Normally, such instruments come in the form of directives and regulations and their updates. So in December 2018, the EU introduced a new set of EU telecom rules called the European Electronic Communications Code, speak EECC. I mentioned that also because Huawei is active in the telecommunication industry. So of course, this is essential for us. And the EECC was adopted to update the existing framework that existed before and intended to essentially paving the way for the rollout of fiber on the one hand, on the fixed line side, and you all are aware of the so-called 5G mobile network technology, the newest mobile telecommunication technology currently in the process of being rolled out. So the EECC does provide for more stringent security requirements for electronic communication providers. Also increased reporting obligations. So network operators have to report security incidents. And finally, there's a more general, or you may say generic, obligation to maintain, quote, appropriate and proportionate technical and organizational security measures. But it doesn't go into much more detail. So the technical organizational security measures, that's what you know as TORMs. You find the same or similar term in the Gdpr, for instance. So the EECC also strengthened the powers of the competent authorities in the member states to enforce security requirements towards operators. However, the way it was designed still followed the previous EU telecoms legislation, so providing for broad general security requirements, for instance, the TORMs that I mentioned, but at the same time, leaving much room for member states to fill in the gaps with their own ideas. And it has then only been in the July of this year that the Commission has provided more detailed so-called guidelines for security measures under the EECC, but that is an element of soft law guidelines, trying to nudge members and to a certain extent operators to more coherence in terms of telco cybersecurity measures. Okay, that was the EECC. Another important element of the EU cybersecurity framework is, of course, the so-called EU Cybersecurity Act, effective from April 2019. But of course, which is much less comprehensive than the name make it appear. The Cybersecurity Act has been designed first and foremost to strengthen the EU Agency for Cybersecurity, ENISA. So we do have a European Cybersecurity Agency with certain powers. That's certainly progress. Then it also establishes a cybersecurity certification framework for products and services, but it is a stopping short of providing any mandatory certification by and of itself. Okay, so that's the Cybersecurity Act. We had the EECC, the Cybersecurity Act. Then we may also mention the GDPR. It has been developed into the gold standard for data protection on a global stage. As we speak, you will all be familiar with it. It is setting out only data protection rules, of course, but in the course of that, it provides also for more detailed requirements for so-called TOMs, the technical organizational measures. I mean, there's many other aspects to be discussed with the GDPR. Maybe one of the striking ones is the level of fines that it does impose. But that's more limited to data protection. So if we look into what the Commission calls the more vertical realms, so the more product-specific legislation, we find a recent initiative was a proposal for an Artificial Intelligence Act that also contains quite detailed security requirements for this particular domain. One may also want to mention the security, the intentions to introduce security aspects into an update of the Product Liability Directive, where such update could substantially actually expand liability for manufacturers of ICT products. In security terms, of course. So there are a number of vertical initiatives as we speak. Which brings us to another key element of the EU security framework, which I have not mentioned so far. So a cornerstone of the existing framework, and at the same time, also a decisive instrument for its further development, is the first 2016 so-called EU Network and Information Security Directive, lingo NIS Directive. You may have heard about it. And more recently, the proposals for an update, so-called NIS 2. The latest proposal, Commission proposal from December. So the NIS Directive from 2016 provided for high-level security requirements for certain categories of critical infrastructure. So for instance, in the energy sector, for instance, I mean, anything that can be seen as critical infrastructure in a EU member state. However, in the terms of security, it's still in its approach and also in the level of granularity, it is more similar to what we already know, what I have already referenced to in the telecommunication sector and also in the previous telco framework. So what you find is that it provides for the obligation of member states to ensure that operators of essential services relating to critical infrastructure take appropriate and proportionate technical and organizational measures, that's the familiar terms, to manage the risks posed to the security of network and information systems. And then another key element is that they also introduce a mandatory notification of security incidents. And also they introduced the NIS Cooperation Group, consisting of representatives of the EU, member states, EU member states, the Commission and ENISA. Well, we will still come back to the NIS Cooperation Group in a second. So with regard, there are certainly a few other directors you may mention, but I think this gives you a general understanding of the framework where we're coming from. So with regards to the legislative instruments introduced on EU level, you can say that a comprehensive cybersecurity framework is developing more in a step-by-step approach, but with expanding security requirements, slowly moving to an ever-increasing scope, particularly with a view to connected devices and infrastructure. But in March 2019, then the European Commission set out the roadmap for a slightly different approach, and that is interesting. So all the above, you can see, have been directives, regulations. So now the Commission identified that 5G, I'm speaking for Huawei, you expect me to speak about 5G, so I will not disappoint you. So the Commission identified that 5G, the most recent technology for mobile telecommunication networks, yes, once rolled out, quote, will form the backbone for a wide range of services essential for the functioning of the internal market and the maintenance and operation of vital societal and economic functions such as energy, transport, banking and health, as well as industrial control systems, unquote. In other words, 5G would form the backbone essential for the functioning of a number of important critical infrastructures in the EU and EU member states. The Commission also highlighted that disruptions of 5G networks could have major implications, which could be felt way beyond the telecommunication networks themselves. And for this reason, rightly so, the security of 5G networks was regarded as of strategic importance for the EU. And then the Commission proposed a multi-step approach. To start with, a so-called joint coordinated risk assessment to be led by the Nice Cooperation Group. Yeah, again, I mentioned it, consisting of the Commission, the member states, and ENISA, the European Cybersecurity Agency. And so the first step, the joint coordinated risk assessment, and then for such risk assessment to result in a non-binding toolbox for 5G, recommending mitigating measures. So what is noteworthy already from the outset? So looking at the roadmap is a reliance on so-called soft law. So essentially, they were planning, and they did, establish a set of assessments, recommendations, and reports on EU level, combined with the somewhat optimistic expectation that member states would then endeavor to implement security measures for 5G in a coordinated fashion. And then in July 2019, the Commission released the so-called EU coordinated 5G risk assessment. It was based on the national risk assessments submitted by all member states. It then aimed to identify the main cyber threats and actors, the most sensitive assets, key vulnerabilities, and a number of strategic risks. What the assessment did identify was an increased exposure to attacks and more potential entry points for attackers. In particular, they alluded to the dependence of telecommunication networks on software, which is, of course, something which not only applies to the telecommunication sector, but applies also to other industry sectors in which you may be active in. It also described that certain pieces of network equipment or functions are becoming more sensitive, and therefore it provided a classification of network functions into categories such as critical, high risk, and low risk, but going into quite level of a detail when describing different parts of a network. And then finally, it pointed to the risk relating to suppliers' risk profiles. They, for instance, mentioned the risk of over-reliance on equipment monocultures. Well, that means depending only on one equipment manufacturer in a country or in a network. And it also introduced a political dimension in pointing to the risk of interference of suppliers by non-EU governments. And this was, of course, also widely discussed in the media. However, in line with the roadmap set out by the Commission in their 5G recommendation, this did not enter into the standard process foreseen for EU legislation. So it did not start the process to introduce a directive or regulation. Instead, as planned, as set out in the roadmap, it resulted into a set of extensive but non-binding recommendations, which you may have heard of, and is called the EU 5G Toolbox. The 5G Toolbox introduced 3 types of measures to be implemented by EU member states. So first, so-called technical measures, network security, resilience, suppliers processes. I think many aspects you may also find in the most relevant cybersecurity standards available. So first, technical measures. Second, so-called strategic measures. For instance, improving powers of authorities and requirements regarding third-party suppliers and vendors. So first, technical measures, strategic measures. Finally, supporting measures. For instance, increased exchange of information between member states authorities. But even though it was designed with the best intention to establish a level of coordination between member states, it may, in fact, have achieved quite the opposite. So let's have a look. So if we look around the fragmentation of security requirements taken by EU member states, it is significant, and that's just a very high fragmentation. Following the 5G toolbox, some member states, for instance, have introduced pre-approval processes, so-called ex-ante controls, before certain 5G equipment can be deployed in 5G networks. So a network operator, before they can deploy a certain 5G equipment, they need to notify to the relevant EU member authorities, and then either such deployment will be prohibited, or they even need to seek an active approval. Others, on the other hand, have not deployed any such ex-ante controls and rely more on so-called ex-post controls. So first, equipment, 5G equipment can be deployed, and then later they have empowered their security and telecommunication regulators to monitor and enforce security rules. So we have already the distinction of some introduced ex-ante controls, pre-approval, others ex-post controls. But even for those who rely on the ex-ante pre-approval, it seems each member state has taken a slightly different route. So some, for instance, apply such requirements to each and all 5G equipment. Others follow a much more nuanced approach, focusing on the more sensitive functions for the pre-approval, whereas the less sensitive functions are not subject to pre-approval. And that arguably is more in line with the nuanced classification that you can also find in the EU 5G coordinated risk assessment. Then you have member states who attach conditions to frequency auctions relating to which equipment can be deployed. The vast majority of EU member states, on the other hand, does not. Then again, some require pre-approval only for non-EU supplier equipment. Then again, there's other, well, most of the EU member states, they apply them more generally to all suppliers, supposedly also to avoid potential challenges under WTO law. So the World Trade Organization trade rules. Then again, some EU member states have applied pre-approvals only to so-called high-risk vendors, but yet each with their own tailored set of criteria, and each with a distinct process, and each with their own distinct timeline for the relevant procedure. Some even apply market caps market caps for certain suppliers. But those who do, each based on their own customized criteria, and so on. I think you get the picture. So where the telecommunication directive, and in its current form called the EECC, we heard about it above. So where the EEC directive was designed to remove market access obstacles in individual EU member states, to come to more coherence, to move closer to what the EU calls a single digital market, it seems we have now moved to a patchwork of individual market access restrictions aimed at 5G network operators and more specifically their suppliers. So you may say the 5G toolbox was an honest attempt at coordinating the approach among EU member states. However, it has actually led to more rather than less fragmentation. And despite all the laudable progress in terms of a gradual increase of security regulation, which I think is very positive, but in terms of the fragmentation of the EU single digital market, we even may have fallen behind what had been achieved under the existing legislative framework. So complicating the matter is the influence of third country powers. The EU 5G toolbox endeavored to regain the digital sovereignty of the EU as a geopolitical bloc. But in fact, a number of member states have now entered into so-called joint declarations on 5G security with a great power across the Atlantic, and have then subsequently moved to implement the content of such joint declarations in little more than a copy and paste exercise. So any law which results of such joint declaration with a transatlantic power, unsurprisingly, often lacks the more comprehensive approach recommended by the EU toolbox. Instead, such laws normally narrowly focus only on the most politicized criteria for market access restrictions. By relying on so-called soft law, so non-binding recommendations, the EU may in fact, contrary to its intentions, may have undermined the coherence of its existing telecommunication framework. Instead, it appears, possibly inadvertently, it may have encouraged member states to restrict market access based on wide.
Hi, Jan. So sorry to jump in there. We're running slightly over time. I do apologize. We've got the next panel waiting to join. I'm just going to hand things over to Kevin. Maybe we could squeeze in one question. But Jan, are there any presentation slides you could perhaps share with the audience after?
I can, yes, I will look into that.
Great. Perfect. Yes, sorry.
I understand we had 14 minutes for including the Q&A, right?
It's 30 minutes including the Q&A.
Oh.
Do apologize, but we can perhaps squeeze in one question from the audience. If that's okay with you, Kevin, I'll hand things over to you.
Jan, thank you for a passionate and engaging discussion. It has triggered some questions. I'm gonna put the more provocative, maybe more difficult one that's come up to you.
Please go ahead.
I'll read it out. So, how will Huawei, as a Chinese company, ensure supply of spare parts and updates to the EU in case of Chinese government diktat to block exports to EU countries? Who may fall foul of the PRC by being critical of Chinese actions internally or other sort of contentious subjects. I paraphrase somewhat, but I think you get the drift.
No, so of course, so Huawei is working with all the key telecommunication network operators in Europe and across the world. So we have a long-lasting relationship of a trust. And this, of course, also means that we will always, of course, do everything which is in our hands to secure supplies. I think something that maybe some in the audience may not know is that there's no supplier, European or Chinese, who is not manufacturing in China. So I think currently it is rather, it is rather other world powers who are trying to squeeze the supplies, but also that has been, I think, handled securely and to the satisfaction of all our customers.
Thank you so much, Jan. And the topic of trust actually is integral to the next panel. So I extend my thanks from the audience to you, Jan. I'm sure some people will be in touch with you separately to continue the discussion. Your company's been very much in the public eye, and it's a fascinating situation that we're watching unfold in front of our eyes. And I'm delighted to introduce Rosanna Pfaffhauser and Roberto Soprano now for the next panel. Again, Jan was talking about trust. We are going to be, well, Rosanna and Roberto are going to be talking to us about moving beyond silos, and in particular, how to remove inner barriers, create trusting collaborations, and ultimately add value to the legal team. We had yesterday a panel suggesting that in-house counsel were going to be tip of the spear when it came to improving their company's ESG performance and focus. And I don't think there was a single discussion yesterday where the issue of silos, getting buy-in and collaboration and trust didn't come up. So I'm delighted to introduce Rosanna Pfaffhauser, who's head of legal at Mundipharma, based in Basel, and Roberto Soprano, who's global director of legal and compliance at Firmenich. I will let them introduce themselves, and then we will kick off the topic in earnest.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and hi, Roberto. It's nice to be part of this discussion group today. I do think the topic is really interesting. It's somewhat interpersonal, so it's a valuable time spent to see what maybe are some of the experiences that we have, and also curious to see what questions maybe come today, and maybe what experiences some people of the audience can share with us. As you said, I'm head of legal for the global marketing and sales services function in Mundipharma. Mundipharma is a pharmaceutical company with around 3,600 employees, and the focus is on pain and supportive care, also in the consumer health area with the Betadine franchise. So yeah, curious to see what discussion today is going to bring. Over to you, Roberto.
Thank you. And I'm also curious to see not only the question, but also if we can get some feedback also from, or sharing experience from the whole audience. I'm really curious to see also how other companies are doing in this area. As for myself, I'm Roberto, director in the legal and compliance team of Firmenich. We produce flavors and fragrances for particularly perfumery and the body and home care products. I'm based in Barcelona, and Firmenich is a Swiss company.
Thank you, Roberto. And we'll start by talking about removing inner barriers, and in particular, how to strengthen self-leadership within a legal team. Rosanna, do you want to give us your thoughts and experience on this? And then Anila will kick off a polling question relatively early to give people time to answer, and then for us to respond.
Yeah, sure. I mean, strengthening self-leadership is an interesting topic, and it has come up more and more in the last couple of years. And I think timely so, we've seen a lot of change, a lot of organizations have gone through change and transformation. And now with the pandemic, more change in security, remote teams have really put another level of stress on teams. And I so think that a focus on developing not only the talent with know-how, but also with self-leadership workshops is key. You know, when I sort of started my role with the legal team, I asked myself, you know, how could that look like? A team that is made up of strong individuals and, you know, really are equipped to navigate through these uncertain times, navigate being remote, have sort of that sense of belonging. And was really interested also to see, you know, what are sort of current statistics showing? Is this a real need to develop teams, or is this just a nice to have? And very interestingly, there is a statistics from Gallup, and actually shows that if you do focus on developing teams, that teams do know what their strengths are. So there is a focus on developing a strengths-led approach. It actually shows that, you know, retention of teams is increased by 17%. So teams or individuals are leaving the company less often, and overall, you know, an increase in productivity of 21% was shown. So I find that really fascinating. So it's also, the data shows us that focusing on self-leadership is a smart decision. So how do we do that? I guess that's then the question, right? An example that I can share today with you all is I have developed a self-leadership workshop, relatively straightforward, straight into the pandemic, really tackling that need to develop the team and focus on these elements that I've just mentioned. This workshop is working with the principle of Dharma. And Dharma is actually a principle with multiple meanings from Indian religions. So it's a bit of a novelty maybe to share this here today, but from a Buddhist perspective, Dharma is the path to enlightenment. And no worries, I don't want to send the legal team to a path of enlightenment, but I just thought it was really interesting to take some of these principles and see what can we take from this and maybe apply in our self-leadership program. So Dharma is consisting of three elements. In very simple terms, it actually is the combination of one's strength together with one's passion and applying this in service of others. As the legal function is a service function, I felt this is actually quite to the point. So why don't we try to apply this principle in our workshop, and then basically in setting our own development objectives, but also applying this in projects and, you know, really enabling the organization's goals. And so the workshop is really consistent of these parts, right? It's looking into passion, utilizing some tools that are available, looking into strengths, the strengths of each individual. Again, there are a broad variety of tools that you can utilize for the team to sort of deep dive into what is my strength. And then last but not least, applying these two in sort of a more business or development objective setting focus. So basically giving the team the tools to understand, if I am passionate about a certain project and if I apply my strengths, you know, I can really thrive, you know, pushing this project further. And what I've seen are two things, interestingly. So one, certainly, I think what the statistics said is something I've seen. So more engaged, thriving teams, basically. The other element that I thought was really interesting was a bit of a side product, but having had that once a month, half a day time where we just share with each other, we work on these interpersonal principles, has actually really led to a very good and open discussion. It has ultimately led to trust because people were vulnerable, have brought their true self to the meeting. We were able to really have open discussions. And so the effect of this all was, I think, a resilient team has emerged from it. And I do know resilience is a bit of a buzzword. I don't want to push it. It has been a bit overused, but ultimately this is what the effect of this workshop was as well. So I can highly recommend investing in time to develop self-leadership.
Thank you, Rosanna. And I certainly can think of a few lawyers who could do with being put on the path to self-enlightenment. And despite my inherent dislike of buzzwords, I think the last 20 months have shown that when a disruptive event like the pandemic happens, we do need to arm our colleagues better to withstand quite dramatic changes to their working life. And resilience, in that sense, resilience really resonates with me. I think people in risk and legal functions who possibly are sometimes a bit isolated in their organizations anyway, potentially suffered more when working fully remotely and not having that human contact, when sometimes they have to be the sensible voice in the room that has to explain to the wider organization why some things that sound great are actually a bad idea. We have a polling question up. I will give you all time to answer, and we're trying to tease out the focus and investment you're making in developing your legal teams. And while you answer the polling question, I'd like Roberto to share his views and his experience on this topic.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, I definitely echo what Rosanna just mentioned, because it is definitely self-leadership who is driving this change, and it's definitely a change that we want to create. We want to have also a cultural change in the department, and I think it's our role to instill such a culture of trust, of co-ownership, of cooperation in the company. This is the key for me to remove the inner barriers, because that's also what we are discussing, and it's something where we are investing a lot in the company in terms of, again, of cultural change, and we promote a culture of co-decision, cooperation, co-ownership of the decision making, because we understand that as Rosanna just mentioned, I mean, promoting self-leadership is investing in self-leadership has a high return of investment, if we can say so. It's maybe difficult to measure, but definitely it's something that you feel it when you see that. In particular in the legal department, the people start to feel part of a wider organization, of a group, of a team, of the company, of the process. They are not only working as taking an action, a step into a process. Then they feel that they belong to something, and they put their passion, and then this is the key for the change. Because this is exactly the change that you want to generate, is a change in the behavior that we want to generate in all our employees. And we want to promote a culture by which if you feel that you're part, that you belong, that you do not consider that an issue, maybe it's not your issue because it's not falling into your garden, but you are able to look at a broader picture, and you feel that you are part of the solution, that you are part and parcel of the company, then is where people start to, sorry for the echo, but I don't know if it's going to improve, but the point I want to make is that exactly this is the behavior that we want to generate with in the company, in the department first, and then in the company, that can help us to remove all the barriers. How do we do? I mean, it's definitely a communication part, very strong. We have 3 different layers in our company. A high level, setting the tone, setting the message, sending the message, clear message to everyone. And another one is another layer is the part on where the ambassador have received the message and then transfer the message to another level, but in a different way, more as a coaching, more as a mentoring, more as a sharing activities in meetings. And then the last one is our daily activities. it's discussing, it's reporting, it's analyzing the work we do every day in the light of the cultural change that we want to generate. And this is again, this is the key for us to bring the cultural change, to make sure that we create a culture of cooperation, that we can ensure that people feel that they belong to something and they are part of the solution.
Thank you, Roberto. And look, I'm glad to see the answers of the polling question that highlights that most of the respondents on today's session say that in their organization, there is time invested in developing legal teams. The majority of you agree that it's some focus, more leading by example, more ad hoc, rather than more targeted. But the split is still very much on answers B and C. One question I have for Rosanna and Roberto is, historically, whether you are an in-house counsel or head of ethics, or maybe on the compliance side of things, lawyers tend to focus on technical training. You're technical experts. How does that fit in with some of the things that Roberto and Rosanna were talking about in terms of resilience and developing softer skills?
Rosanna, if you want to go first. To me, if I can say about my experience, probably was tough at the beginning, moving out of law firms and having a different approach in-house, so developing other skills, understanding my role in the company, understanding how should translate my services to the company to develop this mindset of being able to communicate with everyone, to be proactively everywhere, and then it's something that we experience, and then with practice in-house you start to develop.
Well, from historic, that sounds like it's years ago, but for me it was quite quickly clear when I moved in-house that I'm just curious to get smart about my work. I'm just passionate about actually providing value to the organization, to the business team that I'm working with, wanted to be part of a team, wanted to really add that value. And it very quickly became clear, the smart approach is not only on know-how and on utilizing tools, and we've heard a lot about the tech op tools, right, that you can utilize to work smarter, work more efficient, but also how can we as individuals, be more valuable ultimately to the organization. And for me, that work has, certainly with coaches, sort of for myself, really deep diving into how can I bring my best self to work, to truly connect with the business and to overcome this silo mentality, which is more a bit of a, sort of kind of that privileged and confidential sphere of the legal department, but sort of break that down when it's really appropriate. And for me, that connecting factor was actually one of the learnings I took for myself, is that I need to step away from that role thinking. So I should not see myself as a lawyer when I speak to the CEO or to the finance partner, but you're a team, these are people. So you can honestly bring your authentic self to the table and really connect and collaborate. And sort of that element of connection and collaboration, I've witnessed really creates a trusting team. And for me, that path has really probably made me who I am today, which is why it's important to me to focus on these elements with my team, because I see the benefit of a lawyer having, it's sort of that business partners is another buzzword that we're using. But for me, it's actually much more integrated in a team. And the term team for me is not necessarily just legal, but it's actually, it can be a project, it's ultimately the organization, because you want to support and enable the objectives, and other functions and other people want to do the same. So having that approach of stepping away from that role in a natural way to connect with the business is sort of where I'm coming from, and my interest in passing on that message to my team as well. And of course, that's just one element, right, of our legal service, because it's much more faceted. Yeah, you want to develop know-how, you want to ensure that you're on this digital transformation to generate the value for the organization as well. But again, for me, a key piece to not forget is developing our teams, developing the individuals to make them fit basically for what's to come.
Thanks, Rosanna. And Roberto, you had your hand up.
Sorry.
No worries. Now, once you've developed this culture within your team, once you've built that trust, once you've invested with your people, of course, the difficulty is, in order to add value, you need to deliver. In order to deliver, you need to be resourced appropriately. And I think in the 20-odd years I've worked closely with general counsels, I don't think I've ever met a single one who has complained because he or she was over-resourced in his or her particular role. So how easy is it to get support and resources for your team in order to not just have a well-rounded, resilient team and build those trusting relationships, but to be able to deliver? Is it still hard, or does the increase of regulatory requirement, does a better understanding of reputational risk, and a greater appreciation of the fact you need a solid legal team in order to be successful commercially, has that made things easier? Roberto, how hard do you think it still is to get the resources you need to get the job done?
Yeah, when I was preparing a bit what to say for this conference, I was saying, well, this is $1 million question, and I will need the magic stick to say it's easy and revealing how to get resources on board. And definitely there is a difference in getting internal or external resources. I mean, I see that we need to pass through different processes. I mean, hiring internal person might be a more difficult exercise. And what I was doing when I was preparing this intervention, then I was thinking about all the things to consider when we need to hire a person, which for me is still something which is difficult. The economic conditions generally in the market are not helping when it's a matter of discussing resources, and crises happen very often in this century. So it's also something to consider. But we probably all know that we need to build a business case. Definitely, the most important part is to build a solid and robust argument for the request. Compliance law is the request. It might be, we have a workload increase. We might need to file more patents because that's a company strategy, and we need somebody in the team. We might have new activities or new areas where the company is evolving, is going into different markets, and so we don't have internal knowledge for that part. Or we have new areas. I'm working, for example, in trade compliance, which is something it's not included in all the legal departments or other departments in all the companies, or Gdpr, for example. I mean, companies started only recently to have onboarding a specialist on this subject. And then we need to justify the added value that we're going to bring to the company. It's very often difficult to measure it. It's definitely risk avoidance. It's something that we cannot measure, that we cannot dollarize. And so it's not something easy to consider. You might justify all the problems and that you face every day, and then hiring a new person will be useful to solve the problem. And also, what I thought it was also useful is to link it to the company strategy. So bringing this resource that you want to hire into a context, into the strategy of the company and also of the legal department, because the strategy of the legal department is also a strategy, maybe is a hiring strategy, which is different than the one that you have in mind. And so convincing the general counsel that your resource is the priority instead of another, it's also something that might be challenging, because the budget, it's always limited, and the people requesting resources from all the different teams are always increasing. And that's then also it's also interesting to consider the discussion you might have with human resources, because human resources also, they have a strategy. They might want to hire only person of you need to defend your position on which career ladder you want, and why a more junior position is not ideal for the solution, and why this person cannot be located in a completely different country that you have in mind, which has a cost for the company which is lower. But you know, it's also difficult to attract talent in certain countries, and it's true that particularly new generation move a lot, but certain countries are less attractive from salary-wise, for living conditions, and this is something always to consider in the discussion. And last but not least, I think one of the key points is to build, to use your network and get the support internally and in particular externally. I mean, within the legal department, it's good to have support for your request, but maybe you are competing with somebody else, and we just say that the budget is limited. And but having support also from the division, and particularly from the business division, may be also a key to discuss, to have a positive outcome of your discussion with the head of the department.
Thanks, Roberto. And unfortunately, often when you ask the $1 million question of resourcing, you get a $10,000 answer. We're going to ask the audience the sort of challenges they face, you know, in their current or former organizations. You know, how hard is it to get the right resources in risk functions and in legal teams in particular? And we've made it easy for you. We're just asking you whether you find it difficult, not difficult, or just easy. And while the audience sort of answers, Rosanna, what advice would you have to give people who are trying to justify additional resources? Roberto's giving us some answers, some ideas, but in your experience, what's worked? What's a successful strategy to get what you need to get the job done?
Yeah, I agree with Roberto's points, very valuable. So let me think of something maybe that he has not touched upon. What I have utilized and what I found was really helpful was, before making a case for additional resource, be that internal or external, I have really focused on, assessing the key risks. And I guess in the last couple of years, of course, Gdpr is kind of the is one of the main changes, but things have changed significantly. And as I've said before, organizations go through transformations, which brings a whole different type of risks and challenges with it. So my approach really was to deep dive into what is the organization's or the function's objectives, and what particular risks are associated with these objectives. So really objective focused, because I ultimately want to enable these objectives as a legal counsel, as a head of legal of the commercial function. And what this showed actually was a very clear heat map, which of the objectives bear the highest risks. And that is where the focus is. So it's a very focused approach. And then actually agreeing within the business on a legal mitigating strategy. One could also call that a service catalog. And that's a term that is used in risk management. So you do agree with the business on a service catalog, depending on the risks you see, the likelihood, the impact, and the risk appetite of the organization. And once you're getting to that mitigating strategy or service catalog, you actually can have a check with, what talent do you have in your team? What type of resources do you need in order to, have these mitigating strategies executed? And then, you can really come down to, the books and make a very informed decision, because the whole process of risk management is fully informed and as aligned with the leadership team. So it's a very strong approach, because then it ultimately is clear to everyone, we need to focus on this and we need more resource in this area because we do not have that know-how yet. And it, ultimately was then actually a very simple case to make, specifically with data privacy, where we, did obtain some additional resources externally. And honestly, it was not a difficult business case to make, because you approach it from a very focused, risk-based approach, and you say, okay, this is what we have, but this is what we need as a key risk, and we need to mitigate in order to enable these new global initiatives, basically. So that approach has really helped strengthening the whole dialogue actually with the business. And at the same time, it was fully informed. It was kind of initiated through the leadership team discussion, and not sort of as a, I'm sitting behind my desk, I'm making a business case and present it then and have to defend it. But sort of the approach is the other way around, right? The business understands where the risks are. The business understands the resources that we have. You agree on a risk appetite, and you then jointly agree on how you're going to manage that. And the other point is, it doesn't stop with legal resources. And Roberto made a very nice point there about, I think it was culture of cooperation that you've mentioned, Roberto. And that cooperation is certainly something in our organization is lived very strongly. So it's that purpose of care and collaboration, and something we really want to see also in leading projects and really working together. So support is not only within the legal function, but can also come from other functions depending on the projects you're leading. So it's a broader point of view, and it's not only limited to the legal function. So it actually becomes truly cross-functional, even when talking about resources.
Thanks, Rosanna. And I mean, again, to go back to the point of trust and collaboration, both you and Roberto point firmly to external resources as an option, and as an option that can really help, especially on specific cases where the business case is easy to make. But how do you get trust and collaboration from all your internal clients when you are essentially passing them on to an external resource? Is it harder? Do you have to handle it differently? Roberto, what's your experience been? And then I'll come back to you, Rosanna, with the same question. Essentially, how do you get the most out of those? And the lawyers, the external lawyers in the audience will, I suspect, take notes. How do you break that barrier down and become a partner when initially the first reaction from some of your internal stakeholders will be, oh, well, they're external, they don't really understand our business?
Well, that depends on your role, the role you play when you introduce somebody from externally, because it's you are the link between the company and the external counsel. You are the one translating also the technical advice into something that will fit into the organization. You need to lead this process, and I think they also understand that we cannot know everything. I mean, our colleagues know, and we also know that they need to go to external external partners, but to get some insight or something new or something more, some advice from external. It's the way you coordinate this. You know, you get the input, which very often are technically also in the way they are written. Maybe they are not they cannot be directly addressed to the business division. You are the one who needs to translate this into the business reality. And again, the support. I think also our role is to show them as a support, as an added value, as an investment in something that needs to ensure that we continue, or we can promote the business, but continuously to be in compliance with the law.
Thank you, Roberto. And I don't know whether I should be glad or a bit sad to see that the world has not changed that much during the pandemic. 79% of you still say it's difficult to get the resources that you need. So Rosanna, again, on the topic of getting the most out of external resources, if you've managed to secure them, any advice to the audience?
Well, in my experience, I feel that the key element is focus. And obviously that's something that, you know, needs to be aligned within the leadership team. I guess as an organization, yes, you bring to the table what are the risks. There are certainly some clear no-goes, but what are the risks? What is the risk appetite of the organization? And how do we as an organization manage that? And it's not just a legal department deciding that, but it's really a leadership discussion and decision. And once this is decided, with that clear focus on what is the strategy to enable these objectives, you know, if once you have laid out that baseline, the understanding of when to involve, for example, external counsel for support, should then go hand in hand with that decision that has been agreed in the leadership team, which is the key sort of initial agreement that I feel needs to be there. And of course, there's always ad hoc advice that is needed. But I mean, GDPR is probably a good example, because that is, you know, there is some key knowledge with external counsels that not necessarily has been built up in-house already. And so to really line this up early, explain the impact, explain the challenges early on in the process, and then agree on a mitigating strategy. And then depending on the risk appetite, you can focus on some elements. And this focus obviously then needs to be translated to an external law firm, right? Where do we want to tackle? Where do we see the biggest risk for us? And what is that package going to look like? So for me, that element of focus is really key, and is also valued in the leadership team, because that's certainly the feedback I'm getting, is having that focus and that understanding is key to move on. Because yes, budget discussions are really challenging, and it's not getting better. I think it's rather getting more difficult. So I guess that's one of the elements. And the other element that I just wanted to mention here is, obviously, while resource is getting more challenging, you know, the silo mentality is all of a sudden popping up again. You know, people don't want to do more than they really have to. So it's actually it can really be a downward spiral if you do not tackle, you know, developing the team so that they don't sort of go back into this silo mentality. And at the same time, having that collaboration within the business to ensure that you have appropriate resource. And the final element to mention is again, legal tech ops, right? It's that piece that brings your legal department into the next century, is in essence, really see, where do I actually need to develop talent, in what direction? What can be automated will be automated. So where do we develop our teams towards? And I think that is a discussion that needs to be happening in the leadership team as well, because that is part of a risk mitigating strategy and also an alignment on the resource need.
This is why I'd love to move the discussion to talk about technology a little bit. Technology is coming, and firms are embracing them and looking for efficiencies, looking for gains, looking for cost savings. But introducing new technological tools, especially to support sensitive functions like a legal function, doesn't necessarily fit with trying to build the collaboration and trust that we've been talking about. And I think in a lot of organizations, there's inherent resistance to technology change or to the introduction of new technology solutions. How do you make that work? And how do you build in your technology solutions and strategy without starting to chip away at the culture of trust and collaboration, which you've been working so hard to achieve? Roberto, what are your thoughts on that? And then we'll get Rosanna's experience.
To me, technology is key. Technology is where to invest. Technology in terms of automation, digitalization, that's the future, but it's the future of the legal functions. We need to develop more, we need to use more all the technology that is now available for us. It makes also our life easier, but in addition to this, it really mitigates the risk that for the company where we work. And in terms of creating trust and cooperation, definitely I don't see it as a barrier. Opposite, I think it can definitely improve the way we cooperate within the teams, or I mean, even within the departments, because there is more collaboration. Again, it's an investment for both for the company and for ourselves. I think it's the key. To me, is the area where to go, and it's also the future of our profession. I mean, we need to be lawyers first, but understanding and knowing how to use the tools that we have at disposal, and that's really important. The companies are changing, market are changing, we are changing too, and we need to adapt to this evolution. And again, the tools that I found for my functions really simplify, and now, as I was saying, they are a must in a company if you want to really protect your company.
And Rosanna, are you seeing the same resistance to spend when it comes to tools as people, or actually, is it easier to convince your stakeholders to invest in technology at the moment, than, even though it might be a longer term investment and take slightly longer to impact end users than just throwing bodies at the problem?
It's not an easy one. That certainly needs to have a very strong business case, and you obviously need to show the potential gains, or that you can invest into resources differently if you have technology. So that is something you need to show, and that's not an easy task. So it hasn't gotten easier. I think the understanding that it's needed and that it's a necessity and not a nice to have has arrived. I think that is something that has gotten better, but to really invest smart into a good technology is still a challenge, because what I see is you can implement a tool quite quickly, but whether it actually gives you what it needs to give you, you need to invest in the substance, and that is not only but also a cost point. So to have something that really benefits the legal department is not a simple, we're gonna license in one of these tools and then use it, but it takes much more. And one of these elements that Roberto spoke about earlier quite extensively is that change management element. So it's really onboarding smart technology, but then change the behavior of people. And I think, as I've noticed, is one of the most challenging pieces. How do you bring people to utilize a platform that have done something since ever in a very manual way. It's really hard. And so I feel sometimes as a lawyer, you become a change management project manager. It's insane. It's really, it's a challenge, and that has not gotten easier. I think it just takes time until everyone is understanding that this is a necessity and that's the way to go. But meanwhile, you just have to really manage expectations. You have to make the business case. You have to show the benefits. And this is a constant dialogue to be having in leadership teams to make sure that this is understood. And then the tone from the top, it's lived by example. And then you can bring, the teams also onto this new way of working.
Are there any tools which you think are easier to get buy-in to? Any sort of quick wins that do allow a legal team to focus more on the unique skill set that you bring to a senior management team, and automate some of these things that can suck up your more junior colleagues' time that are still quite manual processes? Yesterday in some of the discussion, people mentioned simple things like the introduction of e-signature as standards, and even very basic contract management systems just to sort of file things properly. But any recommendations you have for the audience on things that might be easier to get buy-in for?
Yeah, certainly the very basics, like a DocuSign or Adobe or whatever there is, in terms of e-signatures is, even though it is there, it's not used throughout and appropriately. So, you actually start there with having that mindset change implemented, and really, of course, reflective of the risks. A contract management tool is equally important. And then, of course, if you can have very standard contracts being fully automated, that frees up a lot of time. And a system that is actually integrated, a platform that links in archiving with managing some of the, the deadlines, for example. All these elements really help, because you just want to avoid having to print, scan, and file, and that is a very silly task to do these days. And if you have a system that takes away some of these manual processes, that is immediately a benefit. And then, of course, you even can go quite far, right? If you then are in sort of the expense management and in litigation, you can really then also show the value of cost savings. But as I've mentioned before, the investment is significant, and the change management needs to happen in order to actually make these gains visible.
Thank you, Rosanna. Roberto, same question to you. And yesterday, during one of the panel discussions, one of the polling questions asked legal teams how digitalized they felt their organizations were, and it showed there was room for improvement. There are still a lot of organizations who have an opportunity, because they're starting from scratch. They are doing everything manually still. Roberto, what's your advice to the audience?
There is always room for improvement, and because I think technology is really going fast. The development in the technology in our area is going fast, and sometimes it's also very difficult to catch up with the news on new technologies which are available for us. And going back on also on your question, if it's easy or what is easier to have as a technology. I've seen that now, for example, it's easier to get technology which is linked to ESG, for example. If I think about in our sector, in a part of our sector where traceability, supply chain traceability, due diligence is also something that you resell with the products. Your standards, what you achieve through due diligence, or what you achieve in terms of respect of human rights or animal welfare, it's something that, or the claims, is something that you can it's something that you can resell. so that it's appreciated by all the company and it's not seen as only something which has a value for the legal department. In my specific area, I think I had probably opportunities to work in companies that were also open, or they were understanding the risk and the investment also in sanctions compliance. For example, it's something that that was, I don't want to say easy to get, but it was easy to share or to demonstrate the risk for the company. So I think those areas is where I think, yeah, definitely contract management and it's also another area where companies invest, but definitely it's a different business case.
Thank you, Roberto. And that, you know, you've shared thoughts on how to remove inner barriers, how to develop teams. We've discussed, you know, how to get the right resources. Let's talk now about how you bring all that together to deliver value to the business. What's your advice on things that will drive productivity, that will leverage creativity, and that will, you know, sort of make you the sort of go-to business partners that a strong legal function should be? Rosanna, we'll start with your thoughts and views, and then I'd love to have some of Roberto's expertise and experience as well.
Big question. So how can I answer that best? I feel it, you know, the legal department of today, or the general counsel of today, needs to have a very smart strategy to develop the legal team to be, you know, ready for how the work is going to look like tomorrow. And it's not an easy task. There is a couple of elements that we've touched upon today that need to be part of that strategy. So what is the model going to look like that you're going to work with in the future? And we see a lot of change, we see a lot of trends, and what is going to be best fit for your organization. So the approach, I believe, is, and Roberto mentioned that also in one of his comments, you know, really integrate that into your organization strategy and purpose. And so the approach is actually to set up a model, you know, in line with the company's objectives, the company's purpose, sort of utilizing some of the business operational model approaches, and then really focusing what is the talent I need, where can I be most efficient, and what technology do I need to enable the business objectives. So it's, you know, it's working basically on maybe have a fresh look at it. Maybe that is it could be a tip for all of us. Let's have a fresh look at where are we today, but what is going to come tomorrow for our organization? What is going to be the challenges of tomorrow? What are the new technologies that will emerge? And where do we need to focus on with our support and our strategy to enable, you know, these objectives that the business will set for itself? So it's having a little bit that futuristic approach to sometimes check in with your legal strategy and then draft that package in line with these elements. That's kind of a very blurry overarching feedback I would get, but it's a really multifaceted, you know, approach, obviously. But having that business approach and see what's to come is for me a key element to ensure that we stay in line with where, you know, the organization wants to go, and that we do not drift apart and potentially drift into a silo again, or just in a silo.
Thank you, Rosanna. And Roberto, we're going to start wrapping up, but if you could give me your thoughts, and I'll encourage the audience to really tap into Rosanna's insights and Roberto's views. You know, do send through questions. But Roberto, on that, you know,
Yeah.
sort of
But
that X factor of adding value.
She covered everything. What I can only add is that probably everything starts time of hiring that person. I mean, understanding whether he has the technical skills for the job first, but also how it can adapt to the company, how it make sure that that you have the view on the future. I mean, how it could adapt to what will be the future of his job, and definitely how much you will need also to train him and to have this cultural change that we want to create, if or that he can follow the culture that you want to create in the company. I think we're running out of time.
I think we've got a question from the audience. We still have time to take a couple of questions. We had a hand raised. Alexander, do you want to? I don't know if we're going to.
Alexander is able to ask the question.
Fantastic! Isn't technology a wonderful thing? we're all ears, Alexander.
Yeah, hi. Thanks a lot, Kevin. Also, Rosanna, Roberto. I very much agree with what Rosanna you said before. I think, looking internally, but also with friends working with other big corporations, you sometimes have, okay, the legal department, of course, needs to become more efficient and needs to digitize, automatize. But as you said, I think the very first step is really to actually identify the pain points and what kind of process a company wants to achieve and what the outcome. And this actually requires at least as much time as actually selecting and implementing a tool. And this is, I mean, so far I've come, at least you see a lot of presentation in this kind of conference, but you meet people who really have a fully fledged end-to-end contract lifecycle management seems to be still very few companies, at least in the German-speaking world. It might be different in the US or UK. And just where I fully agree, because I was currently in challenge where to start. I think we have to start small and start smart. The e-signature was definitely the quick win also at our company. Was not much of a, let's say, hassle or pain. Actually, it was a good example. Legal seemed to be more modern than the business. They were a bit sometimes more reluctant to accept that as really work. But in the end, at least for our business, 90% plus of the cases you can use a simple electronic signature. So thanks. So just that comment because it's of course also kind of a hype, this digital thing, and we also want to go digital. But first of all, you need to know what you want to achieve and where it makes sense to put in the machine.
Thank you, Alexander. And Roberto, Rosanna, a closing comments or some closing comments, please.
Fully agree, and yeah, thanks for sharing the insights from the audience. And I think that term smart is important. It needs to be focused. It needs to be, in collaboration, I guess, with the business. That's for me, these are the key terms that I'm certainly taking from today's talk. And Roberto, also thank you for sharing your thoughts. It's really interesting to have this discussion to see how can we shape the future of a legal department ultimately in order to really be ready for what's to come. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you.